August 1940. The sun blazed over the rugged hills of British Somaliland, and the dry wind carried more than just dust, it carried the sound of war. While Europe was burning under the bombs of the Luftwaffe, another battle was about to unfold far from London, far from Berlin, in one of the most remote corners of the British Empire. Few in the world noticed at first, but what happened here would shake the confidence of a global superpower and feed the ambitions of a dictator who dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire. Italy had entered the Second World War just 2 months earlier, and Benito Mussolini il Duce himself was eager to prove that fascist Italy could stand beside Hitler's Germany as an equal. The war in Africa offered him the perfect opportunity. Across the Horn of Africa, Mussolini's troops were already stationed in Eritrea and Italian East Africa. From these strongholds, the order came: attack British Somaliland. The British colony was small, barren, and poorly defended. To many in London, it was a forgotten outpost, a speck on the map. But to Mussolini, it was a chance to humiliate Winston Churchill and show the world that Italy could strike at the heart of the British Empire. And so, 5 Italian divisions, an army of tens of thousands, bolstered by tanks, armored cars, and colonial soldiers marched toward the desert frontier. Facing them were only a few thousand defenders, a mix of British, Indian, African, and local Somali troops. They were courageous but hopelessly outnumbered. Their mission was not to win, but to hold the line as long as possible, to delay, resist, and survive. What followed was a brutal struggle at a place called Tug Argan Gap, where courage and desperation collided under the unforgiving African sun. This is the story of how Mussolini's forces stormed into British Somaliland, how a handful of defenders fought against impossible odds, and how a tactical withdrawal became both a military lesson and a national embarrassment. It is also the story of propaganda, how a small loss on the map became a powerful weapon in the war of pride and perception. Before we begin this dramatic chapter of World War I, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next episode in our journey through the real stories of the Second World War. Every week, we bring you the untold events, the hidden strategies, and the human courage behind the headlines of history. Now, let us travel back to that scorching August of 1940, to the rocky hills and sun-baked valleys of Somaliland, where a colonial outpost became the stage for one of Mussolini's few military victories, and where Britain, for the first time in centuries, lost a piece of its empire. The sun had barely risen over the Tug Argan Gap when the first rumble of Italian tanks echoed across the dry plains, a sound that seemed almost impossible to ignore, even from miles away. For the small British garrison stationed there, the sight of hundreds of enemy soldiers streaming across the horizon was both terrifying and surreal. They knew that they were outnumbered, vastly outnumbered, in fact perhaps 15 to 1, and yet there was no thought of surrender. No moment of hesitation. These men, drawn from across the British Empire, were determined to hold their ground against overwhelming odds. British soldiers in their familiar khaki uniforms moved alongside African troops, their rifles glinting in the scorching sunlight, while Indian companies adjusted their turbans and checked their positions, all under the watchful eyes of local Somali guides who knew every hidden ridge and crevice of the rugged landscape. They were a diverse and determined force, bound together by duty and the understanding that their stand, however small in scale, could delay the Italians and protect countless civilians further down the line. From the first day of combat, it was clear that the battle would be unlike anything the defenders had faced before. Waves of Italian infantry advanced across the open desert, supported by tanks and artillery, forcing the defenders to fight not only against a relentless enemy, but also against the unforgiving environment. Sand and dust choked the air. The heat pressed down on the men like a physical weight, and the rocky terrain offered little in the way of cover. Still, Each hilltop became a fortress, each ridge a temporary bastion, as soldiers dug in, fired volley after volley, and repelled attack after attack. The defenders knew that they could not hold forever, but every hour they managed to slow the Italian advance bought time for civilians to flee and for strategic decisions to be made. Over the next 5 days, the Tug Argan Gap became a stage of fierce, almost cinematic struggle. The defenders' coordination across such a mix of nationalities was a testament to rigorous training and disciplined leadership. Orders were passed quickly, signals recognized instantly, and every retreat from one position to another was executed with precision rather than panic. It was not a chaotic flight, but a carefully orchestrated withdrawal designed to ensure that the greatest number of lives could be saved while the enemy's momentum was continually checked. The local Camel Corps scouted ahead, reporting movements of the Italian columns and ensuring that reinforcements could be deployed where needed, while the European officers calculated the timing of each defensive stand, always keeping the safety of their men in mind. At the center of this strategy was the Royal Navy, stationed off the coast at Berbera, waiting to take in troops and civilians alike. Knowing that the garrison could not hope to hold indefinitely, the commanders had coordinated the evacuation down to the hour. Civilians of every background, Abyssinians, Arabs, Indians, and Somalis lined up at makeshift embarkation points, clutching whatever belongings they could carry as soldiers formed protective perimeters around them. The retreating forces moved from one hill to the next, sometimes engaging the enemy in brief, brutal clashes to prevent them from breaking through, sometimes silently observing the desert for signs of encirclement, and always moving with a steady, deliberate pace that allowed the Royal Navy to load ship after ship without interruption. Even when Italian units pressed hard, the defenders held their lines long enough to keep the evacuation on schedule. The intensity of the fighting was matched only by the ingenuity of the defenders. They used the natural terrain to their advantage, creating choke points and ambushes that inflicted serious damage on the Italian forces despite the disparity in numbers. Artillery crews positioned on ridges fired with unerring accuracy, taking advantage of the open desert to target advancing columns, while infantry teams shifted positions rapidly, frustrating the enemy's attempts to encircle them. Night offered some relief, but it brought its own dangers, as patrols had to navigate rocky slopes under cover of darkness, knowing that a single misstep could leave them vulnerable to an enemy prowling the shadows. Yet even in these conditions, discipline held firm. Orders were executed without hesitation, and every soldier, regardless of origin, understood the stakes. Their stand was buying not just time, but survival. By the end of the 5th day, the last of the defenders began moving toward the Berbera waterfront. Exhausted, sunburned, and battered, they were a testament to endurance and courage, having slowed a far larger force without breaking ranks. The Royal Navy ships, waiting like silent guardians, took them aboard along with civilians, ensuring that no one was left behind. The withdrawal was more than just a tactical maneuver. It was a carefully measured operation that demonstrated skill, bravery, and coordination across a multinational force under immense pressure. Even as Italian troops entered the town, expecting an easy victory, they found the streets largely emptied of defenders and civilians, a reminder that victory on the map did not erase the heroism of those who had resisted. This chapter of the war, fought far from the headlines in London or Rome, illustrated a profound truth. Courage and strategy can sometimes outweigh sheer numbers, and an orderly retreat, executed with skill and foresight, can become a triumph in its own right. The defenders of Tug Argan Gap had not held the territory, but they had preserved their people and their force, setting a standard for military discipline and human resilience that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. By August 19, 1940, the desert sun over Berbera cast long, unforgiving shadows across the town. marking the culmination of a campaign that had tested both strategy and endurance to their limits. Italian forces, having pushed relentlessly through the Tug Argan Gap and across the harsh Somali landscape, finally reached the gates of Berbera. Expecting resistance, expecting a fight, yet finding a city largely emptied of defenders and civilians who had already been guided to safety by the disciplined withdrawal of British, African, and Indian troops. To the Italians, this was the moment they had been anticipating for months. The realization of Mussolini's ambitions to expand Italy's colonial holdings in East Africa and to assert, with visible proof, the power of fascist Italy on the global stage. The streets of Berbera, once a modest colonial outpost buzzing with commerce and the rhythms of daily life, now stood silent and almost surreal under the banners of the Italian tricolour. Soldiers marched through the town with a mixture of triumph and fatigue etched on their faces. Their uniforms dusty from the long march through desert sands, their boots leaving tracks on the sun-baked streets. For the Italians, the capture of Berbera was not merely a tactical victory. It was a symbol, a trophy of Mussolini's propaganda, designed to be broadcast across Italy as evidence that the fascist state could achieve what few believed possible, that it could wrest territories from the British Empire, even as the larger war consumed Europe. Mussolini, always eager to present himself as a visionary leader restoring the glory of Rome, claimed that the annexation of British Somaliland was a conquest comparable to the greatest in Italian history, a demonstration that fascist Italy could carve out an empire that would rival Britain's own far-flung holdings. Inside Berbera, the remnants of British administration had long since fled, leaving offices and government buildings empty, their contents either packed for evacuation or abandoned in haste. The Italian officers quickly moved to assert control, establishing a new administration under Italian East Africa, implementing bureaucratic measures that were intended to formalize their victory and integrate the territory into Mussolini's grand colonial vision. Beyond the official announcements and proclamations, the streets of the town became a stage for propaganda parades, designed to show both the local population and the wider world that the Italian army had not only conquered territory, but had done so decisively and with discipline. Soldiers paraded in formation, tanks rolled through the center, and the colors of Italy were displayed prominently, signaling to any observer that a new authority had taken command. Yet, for all the ceremonial pomp, the practical realities of the conquest were far more complex. The Italians now faced the challenge of governing a territory whose population had been largely removed, whose infrastructure was minimal, and whose landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Military success on the battlefield did not automatically translate into effective control. The desert's isolation, the scarcity of resources, and the potential for local resistance all posed threats to the durability of Mussolini's claim. Still, the psychological and political impact of the capture of Berbera could not be underestimated. In Rome, newspapers hailed the conquest as a historic achievement, while fascist rallies celebrated the skill and bravery of Italy's colonial forces, reinforcing the narrative of a nation on the rise, reclaiming its place on the world stage. Across the Mediterranean and in London, the news of Berbera's fall resonated differently. For Britain, the loss of a colony, even a small and remote one, was a blow to prestige, especially at a time when the Battle of Britain was already stretching resources and attention to their limits. Winston Churchill, both Prime Minister and Minister of Defence, expressed his frustration at the setback, concerned not only about the practical implications for the Red Sea and regional control but also about the morale of the British public, who were confronted with the image of a rival European power seizing territory on what seemed like a whim. Yet, while the capture of Berbera was dramatic, military analysts recognized that the disciplined evacuation of troops and civilians had mitigated what could have been a far greater disaster. preserving lives and maintaining the integrity of Britain's forces in the region. For Mussolini, the victory became a central talking point in speeches, radio broadcasts, and newspapers. He framed the conquest as a demonstration of Italian ingenuity, courage, and the inevitable ascendancy of fascist Italy over weaker powers. Yet behind the fanfare, there were logistical realities to contend with. Supplying and maintaining control over a remote and sparsely populated territory would prove challenging, and the strategic significance of the conquest was as much psychological as it was material. The southern entrance to the Red Sea was now nominally under Italian control, offering potential leverage over maritime routes. But sustaining a lasting occupation required more than the initial show of force. Still, in the immediate aftermath, Mussolini's propaganda machine capitalized on the moment with remarkable skill. Photographs of soldiers raising the Italian flag over Berbera were circulated widely, and radio broadcasts emphasized the swift and decisive nature of the victory. The narrative was clear. Italy had struck a blow against British imperial power, asserting itself in a corner of the world where few expected dramatic events, and the world should take notice. For the men who had endured the harsh march across the Somali desert, the capture of Berbera was the visible proof that their efforts had yielded results, albeit under the flag of an ambitious dictator seeking glory. The conquest of Berbera stands as a striking example of how battlefield victories can be amplified through propaganda, creating an image of success that extends far beyond the physical territory gained. Mussolini's triumph in Somaliland, though limited in scale compared to the vast theatres of war in Europe, became emblematic of the fascist dream of expansion and dominance, and it demonstrated the ways in which perception and narrative could shape the meaning of military action. For Italy, it was a moment of pride. For Britain, a moment of reflection on the challenges of defending a global empire under the shadow of a rapidly expanding war. It was a victory celebrated in Rome, dissected in London, and remembered in history as an event that, while small in geographical terms, carried an outsized significance in the drama of the Second World War. The fall of Berbera sent shockwaves through London, where the news arrived like a thunderclap in the midst of a nation already bracing itself against the relentless assault of the Luftwaffe. Winston Churchill, simultaneously Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, read the dispatches with a mixture of disbelief and indignation, unable to reconcile the image of British forces relinquishing territory with the pride and resilience he sought to project to the public. To lose a colony, no matter how small or remote, during the height of the Battle of Britain, seemed a bitter and humiliating blow, an affront to the empire he had vowed to defend with every resource at his disposal. In his, the optics were as damaging as the strategic consequences. Newspapers would struggle to spin a narrative of heroism when the headline was so stark. Britain had lost a colony, and Mussolini's troops had claimed the victory with apparent ease. Yet across the deserts of Somaliland, the story told by the men on the ground was far more nuanced. General Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East, had overseen the campaign and the carefully planned withdrawal. He understood that the disparity in numbers, 15 Italians for every British soldier, made holding the Tug Argan gap indefinitely an impossible task. The retreat was not born of cowardice or incompetence but of strategy and foresight, a textbook example of how to preserve forces under overwhelming pressure while still inflicting damage on the enemy. Wavell had monitored every stage of the evacuation, from the positioning of troops on successive ridges to the timing of civilian embarkations at Berbera, ensuring that the Royal Navy could take aboard hundreds of men and women without interference. In his communications with London, he emphasized that the value of lives saved and troops preserved far outweighed the temporary loss of territory, warning that a butcher spill of unnecessary casualties could have far graver consequences for Britain's war effort than the Italians taking a desert colony. The contrast between perception and reality could not have been sharper. In Rome, Mussolini's propaganda machine transformed the capture of Berbera into a narrative of Italian triumph, framing it as the conquest of a territory the size of Britain itself and as proof of fascist Italy's rising power. Italian newspapers ran bold headlines proclaiming the glory of the army and the genius of Il Duce. And military parades through the town became proof to the world that Mussolini's vision of empire was tangible and undeniable. In London, however, the story was more complicated. While Churchill fumed at the setback, military analysts quietly noted the effectiveness of the British withdrawal. The orderly evacuation had denied the Italians the opportunity to inflict catastrophic losses, and it preserved a fighting force that could be redeployed to more critical theatres in the Middle East and beyond. Strategically, the loss of British Somaliland had immediate implications. By taking Berbera and securing control over the southern entrance to the Red Sea, Italy gained a potential foothold that could threaten vital maritime routes connecting Britain with its colonies in India and East Africa. Supply lines that had previously moved with relative freedom were now under the shadow of Italian forces capable of projecting power across the region. The Red Sea, a corridor of immense commercial and military importance, became a potential theatre for further Italian operations, forcing British planners to rethink their defensive priorities and allocate resources to counter the new threat. Yet, despite these challenges, Wavell's careful execution of the withdrawal meant that Britain's core military capacity in the region remained intact, a subtle but crucial victory hidden beneath the more obvious narrative of loss. The psychological impact on both sides was equally significant. Mussolini basked in the glow of success, using the capture of Berbera to reinforce the image of Italy as a rising power capable of challenging the world's greatest empires. Soldiers returning from the campaign were celebrated in parades, and the story of Somaliland became a symbol of fascist achievement, carefully woven into the larger tapestry of propaganda that sought to justify Italy's ambitions in Africa and beyond. For the British public, however, the news served as a reminder of vulnerability, a momentary crack in the image of invincibility that had been cultivated since the outbreak of war. Yet beneath that shock lay a deeper understanding among military leadership that the retreat had been necessary, that the loss of territory did not equate to the collapse of authority or capability, and that preserving trained, organized forces was far more valuable in the long term than clinging to an exposed position in the desert. In private communications, Wavell articulated this reasoning with precision and clarity, emphasizing that the preservation of life and the ability to regroup for future operations were indicators of sound military judgment. The men who had stood against overwhelming odds at Tug Argan Gap had demonstrated courage and discipline that could not be measured simply by the map. Their stand had delayed the enemy, inflicted casualties, and allowed civilians to escape, all while maintaining the cohesion of multinational forces operating in extreme conditions. In essence, the battle was both a tactical withdrawal and a moral statement, illustrating that military effectiveness could be achieved even in apparent defeat. The duality of this moment, the public perception of loss versus the strategic reality of survival, captured the complex nature of global warfare. While Mussolini claimed a triumph for fascist Italy and Churchill grappled with the indignity of losing territory, the defenders of Somaliland had, in fact, executed a campaign of remarkable skill, combining courage, planning, and adaptability to achieve an outcome that preserved both lives and military potential. The southern entrance to the Red Sea was now under Italian control, and the map of empire had shifted, yet the essential human and operational resilience of Britain's forces remained unbroken, setting the stage for future engagements where strategy, discipline, and foresight would prove just as important as the victories celebrated in headlines and propaganda posters. while Italian forces celebrated their victory in the deserts of Somaliland, across the Channel and over the skies of England, another battle raged that would shape the course of the Second World War in ways far more consequential than the capture of a distant colony. August 1940 was a month of relentless pressure on Britain, a period when the Luftwaffe, Adolf Hitler's air force, sought to crush the Royal Air Force and break the resolve of a nation already bracing against the possibility of invasion. And known as Adler or Eagle Day, the campaign was intended to deliver a decisive blow, a calculated effort to gain aerial supremacy and prepare the way for a ground assault that would, in Hitler's calculations, force Britain to surrender. From dawn until dusk, waves of German bombers and fighter escorts swept across the Channel, targeting airfields, radar stations, and industrial centers, seeking to weaken the RAF and undermine the infrastructure upon which Britain's defense depended. The skies were a theater of chaos and courage, with Spitfires and Hurricanes darting like silver flashes against the grey of approaching clouds. Pilots engaging in dogfights that tested the limits of skill, endurance, and nerve. German losses were unexpectedly high, a testament to the skill and determination of British airmen who, despite being outnumbered in some sectors, managed to hold their lines and protect vital installations. Nightfall brought little relief, for the threat of nocturnal raids and the constant hum of engines overhead meant that vigilance was required at every hour. The British people, from London to the coastal towns, endured the anxiety of air raids, the wail of sirens, and the tremors of bombs falling, yet the nation's resolve remained unbroken. Civilian life continued in pockets of extraordinary resilience, with workers repairing airfields, mechanics maintaining aircraft, and volunteers manning anti-aircraft batteries, all contributing to a collective effort that was as crucial as the dogfights above. Meanwhile, the political and military leadership understood the stakes. Hitler's declaration of a naval blockade on August 17 added pressure on British supply lines, with the threat that any neutral ships approaching the British Isles could be sunk on sight, a move designed to strangle the island's economy and resources. The blockade was not just a tactical maneuver. It was a psychological weapon aimed at instilling fear and uncertainty, at signaling that the world was increasingly closing in around Britain. Yet the British response was resilient and adaptive. Intelligence agencies monitored German movements. Naval codes were updated to confound enemy interception, and defensive strategies were continually revised based on the latest reports from the front. Every ship that slipped through the blockade, every U-boat neutralized, and every aircraft returned safely to base became a small but significant victory in a campaign that demanded constant vigilance and innovation. Adding to the complexity of Britain's position was the looming prospect of international support, particularly from the United States. Though still officially neutral, the U.S. had begun moving toward a more active role in aiding Britain, and agreements were quietly forged to provide destroyers in exchange for access to bases in the Western Atlantic and Caribbean. These measures, still in negotiation and not yet public, represented a lifeline for Britain, a source of resources and strategic positioning that would prove critical in sustaining resistance against both air and naval threats. The combination of domestic resilience and emerging international support allowed Britain to continue resisting on multiple fronts, maintaining pressure on the Luftwaffe while simultaneously navigating the broader geopolitical landscape that included potential threats in Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic. In the skies over southern England, the Luftwaffe's ambitious strategies met with unexpected setbacks. Massive formations of bombers, escorted by waves of Messerschmitt fighters, attempted to overwhelm RAF defenses, but coordination challenges, miscalculations, and the extraordinary skill of British pilots resulted in significant German losses. On certain days, the Luftwaffe lost dozens of aircraft in operations intended to cripple the RAF, while Britain's defenders, though also paying a heavy toll, retained sufficient capacity to continue the fight. The failure to achieve total air superiority meant that Hitler's plans for an immediate invasion had to be reconsidered, delaying what had been envisioned as a swift and decisive campaign. These aerial battles, fought over skies filled with smoke, contrails, and the roar of engines, were more than tactical engagements. They were a contest of morale, perception, and industrial endurance, where each lost plane had consequences for both public confidence and military planning. At the same time, Britain's military planners kept a vigilant eye on other theatres, aware that the struggle was not confined to the European mainland. Italian ambitions in East Africa, as demonstrated by the capture of Berbera, represented a potential threat to maritime routes and regional security, even as the RAF and Royal Navy managed to project influence far beyond the British Isles. The interplay between these fronts required constant strategic adjustments, balancing resources between defending the home islands, protecting vital supply lines, and responding to colonial conflicts that, while geographically distant, had significant implications for the empire's overall security. The coordination across air, sea, and land forces, combined with intelligence efforts that monitored enemy movements, allowed Britain to act decisively despite the mounting pressures, demonstrating a level of organizational resilience that became a defining feature of its war effort. Through these events, August 1940 emerged as a pivotal month, highlighting the simultaneous pressures Britain faced from multiple adversaries. While Mussolini celebrated victories in Africa and Hitler intensified attacks from the air and sea, Britain's ability to endure, adapt, and resist became increasingly evident. The interplay of courage on the front lines, the effectiveness of intelligence and logistics, and the anticipation of external support formed a web of defense that would sustain the nation through one of its most perilous periods. Eagle Day, with its ambitions and its setbacks, the naval blockade with its threats and countermeasures, and the distant conquest of Berbera all converged to create a complex tableau of warfare, illustrating the interconnected nature of global conflict and the extraordinary effort required to hold a nation together when the eyes of the world and the ambitions of dictators were fixed squarely upon it. As August drew to a close in 1940, the broader landscape of Europe and the surrounding regions revealed a complex tapestry of conflict, resistance, and the unyielding determination of nations under pressure. While the Italian flag flew over Berbera and Mussolini's ambitions were proclaimed loudly across Rome, other theatres of tension simmered with their own dramas, reminding the world that the Second World War was far from confined to a single front. In the Eastern Mediterranean, relations between Italy and Greece had begun to fray in increasingly dangerous ways. The sinking of the Greek cruiser Hel by an Italian submarine was more than a mere military incident. It was a spark in a powder keg, intensifying hostilities and pushing Greece toward partial mobilization. Military planners across Europe watched with keen interest, aware that the Balkans could erupt into another fiercely contested front, adding yet another layer of complexity to the already convoluted strategic map. For the people of Greece, the skies darkened not only with clouds of war, but with the looming shadow of invasion, a reminder that the struggle for sovereignty would be neither easy nor swift. Meanwhile, in the heart of Europe, Luxembourg faced the heavy hand of German occupation. Gustav Simon, the German administrator in the occupied duchy, had embarked on an aggressive campaign of Germanization, outlawing the use of the French language, changing family names, and disseminating propaganda that insisted on the superiority and exclusivity of the German identity. Yet, Luxembourgish citizens responded with resilience and creativity, igniting a quiet but powerful cultural resistance that became known as the Spenjokrich, or the War of Pin Badges. In towns and villages, patriotic lapel badges appeared on clothing as acts of defiance, subtle yet potent symbols of national pride in the face of oppressive control. The local population, while constrained by the presence of the occupiers, demonstrated that cultural identity could serve as a form of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest periods of military conquest, the human spirit finds ways to endure and assert itself. Amidst these regional tensions, Britain's struggle continued on a more immediate and existential front. The Battle of Britain, now entering its critical phase, had begun to show that determination, skill, and preparation could counter what appeared, at first glance, to be an overwhelming force. German air raids, while destructive and relentless, had failed to achieve the strategic objective of crippling the Royal Air Force or forcing a British capitulation. Instead, the campaign had demonstrated the remarkable resilience of a nation under siege. Pilots, ground crews, and ordinary citizens alike contributed to a collective effort that would prove pivotal not only in terms of military outcomes but in maintaining the morale and cohesion of a country facing the very real threat of invasion. As reports of Luftwaffe losses reached London and strategic successes, however small, were celebrated, a sense of cautious optimism began to take root, suggesting that the tide of war, however slowly, could be influenced by courage, coordination, and sheer determination. The juxtaposition of loss and resilience defined this moment in history. On one hand, British Somaliland had fallen to Italian forces, a defeat that was stark, tangible, and publicly humiliating. Mussolini's victory was loud, symbolic, and politically useful for fascist propaganda, showcasing what appeared to be the expansion of Italian power at the expense of the British Empire. Yet, on the other hand, the careful and skillful evacuation executed by General Wavell and his multinational force ensured that lives were preserved and troops remained available for future campaigns. The tactical success of this withdrawal, though less celebrated than the capturing of a town, represented a significant achievement, a quiet triumph of discipline, foresight, and human endurance under extreme conditions. It served as a reminder that victory in war is rarely a simple measure of territory gained or lost. The preservation of resources, the protection of civilians, and the maintenance of morale are equally crucial metrics of success. In the broader narrative of the war, these simultaneous events, the Italian conquest in Africa, the looming conflict in the Balkans, the cultural resistance in Luxembourg, and the fierce aerial battles over Britain formed a mosaic of struggle and resilience. Each development carried its own significance, yet they were all interlinked by the underlying themes of human courage, strategic decision-making, and the unpredictable interplay between aggression and resistance. The fall of Berbera, while notable for the immediate loss, did not diminish Britain's resolve. Instead, it reinforced the necessity of coordinated strategy, of adapting to circumstances, and of recognizing that even in apparent defeat, opportunities to safeguard the future remain. For Britain, the Battle of Britain became more than a fight for airspace. It became a symbol of national endurance, a turning point in morale that underscored the capacity of a people to withstand sustained pressure, adapt to challenges, and emerge with hope intact. The courage demonstrated by RAF pilots and ground crews, coupled with the disciplined retreats in distant colonies, highlighted a recurring lesson of warfare. Strategic thinking, resilience, and unity often carry equal weight with firepower and numerical advantage. It was this combination of steadfastness at home and measured strategy abroad that allowed Britain to navigate a period of intense danger while preserving the core of its military and national integrity. As we reflect on these events, the stories of courage, adaptability, and quiet heroism resonate across time, offering lessons not only for historians but for all of us seeking to understand the complex interplay between adversity and human response. The months of August 1940, marked by the clash of empires, the rise of resistance, and the resolve of a besieged nation, stand as a testament to the enduring human spirit and the profound impact of strategic foresight. These moments remind us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, determination, ingenuity, and unity can shape the course of history. Thank you for joining this journey into one of the pivotal weeks of the Second World War. If you enjoyed exploring these stories, understanding the strategies and human experiences behind them, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss future episodes. Your support helps bring these moments of history to life and ensures that the lessons of courage, resilience, and strategic thinking continue to inspire generations to come.